Responsible, obligated or charged with the duty of performing some function or fulfilling some obligation. For example, he is responsible for managing the project team. Rest, to cease activity, to relax and regain energy. For example, they took a break and rested after hiking all morning. Restrain, to hold back or control someone or something from doing something. For example, she restrained herself from saying something hurtful in anger. Result, the outcome or consequence of an action or set of circumstances, the final state or condition achieved by some process. For example, her hard work resulted in a successful project. Retire, to withdraw permanently from active employment, usually to receive benefits. It can also mean to go home for rest after working. For example, he retired after 30 years of service. Return, to come back, to bring something back. It can also mean to restore or give back. For example, she returned the book to the library. Revolt, a violent and organized uprising against authority or established control. For example, the peasants revolted against the oppressive ruler. Reward, something given in return for an action or service. A recompense for good behavior or work. For example, he received a reward for his bravery. Rice, an edible starchy cereal grain that is a staple food in many cultures. For example, she cooked rice for dinner. Rich, having much money or possessions, affluent. It can also mean of high quality and flavor. For example, they live in a rich neighborhood and the dessert was rich with flavors. Ride, to sit on or be carried by an animal as a horse while moving along its back. It can also mean to travel in a vehicle. For example, she rides her bike to work every day. Right, the opposite direction of left. The side of the body that is closer to the breast when standing upright. It can also mean proper or correct or a legal entitlement. For example, he turned right at the corner and went straight ahead. Ring, a circular object, something in the shape of a circle. It can also be used to describe a sound that continues for some time after it is first made. For example, she wore a gold ring on her finger. Riot, a violent disturbance of the peace by 3 or more persons assembled together without lawful authority, usually expressing strong disapproval and discontent. For example, a riot broke out during the protest. Rise, to come up, to increase in level or degree. It can also mean to become higher or taller. For example, the sun rises in the east. Risk, the possibility of suffering harm, loss, or injury, exposure to the chance of damage or destruction. For example, she took a risk by starting her own business. River, a natural stream of water that flows toward an ocean, lake, or sea. It can also mean a continuous flow or series of related events or thoughts. For example, she walked along the riverbank. Road, a way or route for traveling from one place to another, especially a main highway. For example, he drove down the road to reach his destination. Rob, to take money or property forcibly by violence or threat. For example, they were robbed at gunpoint during their trip. Rock, a solid mass of mineral material occurring in nature as an individual body large enough to be worked or quarried. It can also mean a hard surface that is difficult to walk on. For example, she stood on the rock by the shore. Rocket, an unpowered projectile fired from a cannon, later used for various weapons and devices using explosives. It is now most commonly associated with a vehicle designed to be launched into space. For example, they watched the rocket launch at night. Roll, to move or lie with part of the body raised or bent in a curve. It can also mean to turn over from side to side. For example, she rolled her eyes in frustration. Roof, the top covering of a building, especially one that extends beyond its walls and protects it against rain. It can also be used metaphorically to mean a cover for something. For example, he climbed up the ladder to fix the roof. Room, a space enclosed by walls and a ceiling, intended for some particular purpose or use. For example, she stayed in a hotel room while on vacation. Root, the part of a plant that is generally attached below the surface of the ground. It supports the plant and absorbs water and minerals from the soil. It can also mean a basic element or cause. For example, he dug up the roots of the plants to replant them. Rope, a thick cord made by twisting together many smaller strands, something like a rope in shape or function. For example, she tied the rope around the package. Rough, harsh and severe, not smooth, polished, or refined. It can also mean roughly done or hastily executed. For example, the ground was rough and uneven. Round, having a circular form. It can also be used to describe something that is generally similar in size on all sides. For example, she bought round bread for the picnic. Row, a line of objects placed side by side. An organized group of oarsmen in a boat. It can also mean to quarrel or dispute. For example, they had a row about the bills. Rub, to move one thing against another with pressure and friction. For example, she rubbed her hands together for warmth. Rubber, a substance made by polymerizing natural or synthetic latex. It has great elasticity. It can also be used as an adjective to describe something that is like rubber. For example, he dropped the rubber ball. Ruin, to destroy completely, to bring to a state of decay and desolation. For example, the fire ruined their home. Rule, a principle or condition that customarily governs behavior, a standard on which a judgment can be made. It can also mean to control as a sovereign. For example, he wrote the rules for the game they were playing. Run, to move with quick, usually light steps in a particular direction. To flow as of water. It can also mean to manage or direct something. For example, she ran the marathon and won first place. Sad, feeling or showing sorrow and unhappiness. For example, she looked sad after hearing the news. Safe, ensuring security, free from harm or risk of injury or loss. For example, make sure all valuables are stored safely. Sail, a piece of canvas stretched across a frame that is used to propel a boat by wind. For example, the ship's sails caught the wind. Salt, a mineral composed of sodium and chloride that is essential for life and is commonly used as a seasoning. For example, salt enhances the flavor of food. Same, identical or similar in kind, quality, quantity, degree, or nature, not different from something else. For example, they wanted to keep everything exactly the same. Sand, a granular material composed of fine mineral particles that can be found on beaches and deserts. For example, she walked barefoot on the warm sand. Satisfy, to fulfill a need or desire completely, to meet expectations fully. For example, her efforts finally satisfied her employer's demands. Save, to keep from injury, loss, or destruction, to preserve for future use. For example, she saved money for an emergency fund. Say, to utter words in order to express thoughts, feelings, or information. For example, he said hello to everyone. Scale, a device that measures weight or mass, a range within which something exists or develops. For example, they used a scale to measure the fish. Scare, to fill with terror, to frighten. For example, the loud noise scared the children. School, an institution for education where students attend classes and learn from teachers. For example, she attends school every day. Science, the study of the physical world and its laws through observation and experimentation. For example, biology is a branch of science. Score, a system of marks or symbols used to represent music, the total sum achieved in a game or contest. For example, he kept score during their friendly match. Script, a document containing the words spoken by actors for a film, play, or television program. For example, she studied the script before her performance. C, A large body of salt water that is part of an ocean but separated from it by a continent or island. For example, they sailed across the sea to reach their destination. Search, to look for something with careful and thorough effort. For example, he searched through all his belongings to find his keys. Season, a period of the year distinguished by special characteristics, a time during which a plant grows or fruits. For example, summer is the season for swimming. Seat, the place where someone sits, an object that can be sat upon. For example, she took her seat in the theater. Second, the second unit of time, coming immediately after the first. It can also mean a position of importance or prestige. For example, he won a silver medal and came in second place. Secret, something kept hidden or not made public, information that is confidential. For example, she shared her secret with her closest friend. Section, a distinct part into which something can be divided, an area within a larger organization. For example, the library has many different sections. Security, safeguarding from danger and keeping safe, measures taken to ensure safety or protect against threats. For example, they installed security cameras for better protection. C, to perceive with the eyes, to notice and comprehend something through sight. For example, she saw the beautiful sunset over the horizon. Seed, the embryonic plant together with its food supply within a fruit or berry, the part of a plant that produces new plants when it germinates. For example, she planted seeds in her garden. Seek, to look for someone or something. To search for example, he sought help from his colleagues. Seem, to appear or seem to be something, to have a particular appearance or effect. For example, it seems like we are running out of time. Seize, to take hold of forcibly. To capture and detain. For example, the police seized the suspect in the middle of the night. Seldom, rarely or infrequently. For example, they seldom visit their grandparents. Self, one's own person, one's individuality. For example, she is proud of herself and achievements. Sell, to exchange money for goods or services. For example, he sells books at the bookstore. Senate, a legislative body consisting of a group of notables who discuss matters in council. For example, the United States Senate is part of the federal government. Send, to cause something to go from one place or person to another, to direct someone away for a time. For example, she sent an email to her friend. Sense, a way of perceiving things externally or internally, such as through sight, hearing, smell, touch, and taste. For example, we use our sense of smell to detect scents. Sentence, a group of words that expresses a complete thought. The unit of grammar consisting of a subject and predicate. For example, she runs is a simple sentence. Separate, to divide into distinct parts or groups, to isolate. For example, they decided to separate their tasks for better organization. Series, a set in which things follow each other in a particular order. For example, the TV series follows the lives of different characters over time. Serious, grave, and important, not joking. For example, he spoke seriously about the importance of education. Serve, to offer food or drinks to guests, to function as an attendant. For example, she serves meals in her restaurant. Set, a collection of similar things belonging together, a group of items with related uses or functions. For example, a set of dishes includes different pieces for various needs. Settle, to become settled or fixed in a place. To resolve a dispute. For example, they finally settled the argument after much discussion. Several, more than two but not many, a small number. For example, she bought several books from the bookstore. Severe, harshly strict, very intense. For example, the weather was too severe for outdoor activities. Sex, the biological category into which individuals are divided on the basis of their reproductive functions. For example, people are classified as male or female based on sex. Shade, a dark or light covering that blocks sunlight, a darker part created by blocking direct sunlight. For example, she used a hat to provide shade from the sun. Shake, to move rapidly back and forth or up and down with short movements, to cause someone to have violent, sudden movements. For example, he shook hands with his friend in greeting. Shall, used for giving instructions or making offers. For example, you shall report to me immediately. Shame, the painful emotion typically arising from consciousness of guilt, fraud, or other shortcoming. A feeling of disgrace. For example, she felt shame after realizing her mistake. Shape, the external form that something has acquired through growth and development, the outline against which color is seen. For example, she cut the dough into different shapes for decoration. Share, to have in common with others, to give part of something to someone else. For example, they share a room at the camp. Sharp, having a fine edge or point that can easily penetrate or cut, keen in feeling or perception. For example, she sharpened her knife before cutting vegetables. She, a female person. For example, she went shopping for groceries today. Sheet, a large piece of fabric used to cover something or someone, such as a bed. For example, he spread out the sheet on the ground. Shelf, one of a series of flat horizontal surfaces fixed to a wall, counter, etc., where things can be placed and stored. For example, she arranged books on the shelf. Shell, the hard covering that surrounds the soft body of certain animals, such as a snail or clam. It can also refer to the outer layer of an egg. For example, she found a beautiful seashell by the beach. Shelter, a place that protects from danger and harm, a roofed building for animals or people. For example, they built a shelter to protect against the rain. Shine, to emit light, to give out beams of light. It can also mean to look bright and attractive. For example, she admired her shining hair in the mirror. Ship, a large vessel with sides higher than its beam and provided with oars, sails, or both for navigation on water. For example, they sailed across the ocean on a ship. Shirt, a piece of clothing worn next to the skin that covers most of the upper part of the body. For example, he wore a white shirt to the office. Shock, the sudden effect of something intense or disturbing, a strong and unpleasant surprise. For example, she was shocked by the news. Shoe, footwear consisting of an enclosing covering for one or both feet. For example, she put on her shoes before leaving home. Shoot, to fire a weapon such as a gun, to attempt to score in games like basketball or soccer. It can also mean to grow quickly. For example, he shoots a rifle during target practice. Shop, a building where goods are sold, a store that sells various items. For example, she went shopping for new clothes. Short, not long from end to end or from top to bottom. For example, the shirt is short and comfortable. Should, used in giving advice or making suggestions. For example, you should eat more vegetables for better health. Shout, to call out with a loud voice, to cry out loudly. For example, she shouted for help when in danger. Show, to make visible, to exhibit something openly. It can also mean to tell someone by using gestures and actions. For example, he showed her the way to the door. Shrink, to become smaller or less dense, to contract in size due to heat, moisture, etc. For example, the fabric shrank after washing. Shut, to close something with a lid, cover, or door. It can also mean to cease operating. For example, she shut the window before it got windy. Sick, afflicted by illness, not well. For example, he feels sick and needs to stay home from work. Side, the opposite of center, as a point where two parts or surfaces meet. An area of something. For example, she stood on the side of the road waiting for a ride. Sign, a symbol that serves as a visible indication, a notice giving information about some fact or regulation. For example, there was a sign indicating the way to exit. Signal, an action or sound that indicates the presence or existence of something else. It can also mean something used in communication. For example, they signaled their intention with hand gestures. Silence, the state of being quiet and having no sounds, stillness. For example, she enjoyed the silence of the library. Silk, a soft fabric made from the thread produced by silkworms, a smooth, fine material. For example, silk dresses are popular for special occasions. Silver, a precious metal used in jewelry and coinage with high conductivity to heat and electricity. It can also refer to something of high quality or value. For example, silver medals were awarded at the competition. Similar, like or alike in most respects, closely resembling but not quite identical. For example, they are similar but not exactly the same. Simple, not complex or compound, consisting of a single part or thing. It can also mean easy to understand and use. For example, she used simple tools for her project. Since, from a past time until now, in recent times. For example, she has been learning music since childhood. Sing, to produce musical sounds with the voice, to perform songs. For example, they sang together at the concert. Single, consisting of only one person or thing as opposed to two. It can also mean being alone. For example, she wears a single piece of jewelry today. Sister, a female sibling. Someone who has the same parents as another person. For example, she is my sister. Sit, to lower oneself until the buttocks are resting on the surface of something, as a chair or stool. To be in an upright position with some part of the body supporting most of one's weight and with the legs bent at the knees. For example, he sat down after a long walk. Situation, a state of affairs, a particular set of circumstances. It can also mean the action of sitting or being seated. For example, she found herself in an awkward situation. Size, the dimensions or magnitude of something as determined by measuring. For example, his shirt size is medium. Skill, knowledge and ability to do something well, dexterity. For example, he has a skill for playing the guitar. Skin, the covering that protects parts of the body. It can also mean an outer layer or covering. For example, she scratched her skin after being bitten by an insect. Skirt, a piece of women's clothing that covers the lower part of the body from the waist to the ankles. For example, she wears a pretty skirt for the event. Sky, the region beyond the Earth's atmosphere, the vaulted heavens. It can also mean the sky as seen from a particular position at a particular time. For example, she watched the sky turn orange during sunset. Slave, a person who is legally owned by another and is forced to provide labor. Someone who is under complete control of another or others. For example, slavery was abolished in most countries centuries ago. Sleep, to be unconscious and inactive, as through loss of bodily sensation for a period, rest by sleeping. For example, she sleeps 8 hours each night. Slide, a flat surface that can be used to move something along it easily. It can also mean to move down quickly or suddenly. For example, he slid down the banister as a child. Slip, to cause someone to fall by moving under their feet, to slip away from a place. For example, she slipped on the wet floor and fell. Slow, moving with moderate speed or great slowness, not fast. It can also mean gradual in progress toward completion. For example, he drives slowly through town. Small, not large in size, volume, extent, etc., diminutive. For example, her small hand held the baby easily. Smart, having a lively and clever mind, clever or intellectually gifted. It can also mean fashionable or chic. For example, she wears smart clothes to work every day. Smash, to break into fragments or pieces by hitting hard, to demolish something completely. For example, he smashed the glass with his fist. Smell, the quality that makes a thing perceived by smell, an odor. It can also mean to perceive an odor with the nose. For example, she smelled the fresh flowers when they arrived. Smile. A facial expression indicating pleasure or amusement, and typically having the upper lip raised slightly higher than the lower lip. For example, her smile brightened everyone's day. Smoke. The gas and fine particles released by burning something such as wood, coal, tobacco. It can also mean to burn slowly and steadily with a low flame. For example, he smokes a pipe for relaxation. Smooth. Even in surface. Free from roughness or irregularity of outline or form. It can also mean easy and unbroken. For example, she applied smooth lotion on her skin. Snack. A small amount of food eaten between regular meals, an informal meal. For example, he had a snack before going to work. Snake. An elongated limbless carnivorous reptile with flexible bodies that move by flexing and extending muscles in waves along their body length. For example, the snake slithered across the grass. Sneeze. To suddenly expel air forcibly through the nose and mouth, to make a sharp, sudden noise. For example, she sneezed after inhaling dust. Snow. The form in which water falls from clouds as ice crystals or minute crystalline particles of ice. It can also mean snow as a natural covering. For example, he loves skiing on fresh snow. So, used to continue statements. So it is expressing agreement. For example, so you want to go out tonight. Sugar. A sweet crystalline substance derived from sugar cane or beets and used in cooking and beverages as a flavor enhancer. It can also mean any of various similar substances such as fructose. For example, she adds sugar to her tea. Suggest. To propose something for consideration. Recommend. For example, he suggested an interesting idea during the meeting. Suit. A man's or woman's formal dress consisting typically of a jacket and trousers or skirt. For example, he wears a suit for his job interviews. Summer. The season when days are longest, nights shortest, temperatures warmest, and plants grow most rapidly. The time of the year that follows spring. For example, they have a summer house by the sea. Sun. A star in the center of our solar system that provides light, heat, etc. to Earth. It can also mean any star like the sun. For example, the sun rises in the east every day. Supervise. To oversee and direct the work of others. Be a supervisor for. For example, he supervises his team at the office. Supply. A quantity of goods or materials made available, a continuous source or amount. It can also mean to provide something needed. For example, they supply water to the village. Support. To give assistance or encouragement, to sustain in some way. It can also mean to hold up with one's body weight or hands and arms. For example, she supports her family through her job. Suppose. To assume as being true, take for granted. For example, they suppose that the meeting will be productive. Suppress. To put an end to something forcibly, to keep down by authority. It can also mean to prevent from growing or developing. For example, she suppressed a yawn. Sure. Certain in belief, opinion, or knowledge, not uncertain, confident. For example, he is sure that his team will win the game. Surface. The outer part of something, such as a liquid, a body, or a three-dimensional object. It can also mean to come up from below the surface. For example, she dived to reach the surface of the water. Surprise. To cause someone to be taken aback, to astonish. It can also mean something that causes surprise. For example, her sudden appearance surprised everyone. Surround. To completely enclose or form a border around something. To be all around in such a manner. For example, the trees surround the house. Survive. To live through a hazardous experience. Outlive someone who died before one does. For example, he survived a serious car accident. Suspect. To believe that something is true or probable without absolute certainty. To have suspicions about. For example, she suspects that her phone was hacked. Suspend, to hang by the neck and lower in such a way that the body dangles freely. It can also mean to stop temporarily or postpone. For example, they suspended operations for maintenance. Swallow, to take food into the stomach, to catch a word in speaking without pronouncing it. For example, she swallowed her pride when faced with the challenge. Swear, to make a formal vow or promise, often with an invocation of deity, to utter words expressing strong feeling. For example, he swore on his honor before making the decision. Sweet, having a pleasant taste, not bitter, sour, or salty. It can also mean full of tenderness and affection. For example, she enjoys sweet treats after dinner. Swim, to move through water by using one's arms and legs in a particular way. For example, he swims laps at the pool every morning. Symbol, a word or object used for something else. A mark that represents an idea or system of belief. For example, the dove is a symbol of peace. Sympathy, compassion for someone who feels unhappy, usually because one shares their misfortune. The feeling of understanding sorrow and sadness that is felt by those affected by another's misfortunes. For example, she expressed her sympathy when hearing about his loss. System, a set of things working together as parts of a mechanism or an interconnection, such as machinery. It can also mean a methodical arrangement or organization. For example, the body has many systems that work together for proper functioning. Table, a flat, horizontal surface used to support something or on which things may be prepared, eaten, etc. For example, they ate their meal at a table. Tail, the part of an animal's body that extends from the rear. The end of something. For example, the dog wagged its tail. Take, to carry or bring away with oneself, to receive and accept. For example, take a deep breath before starting. Talk, to converse verbally, engage in conversation. For example, they talked about their plans for the weekend. Tall, of great height, of considerable length from top to bottom. For example, he is tall and has long legs. Target, an object aimed at by a missile or projectile. Something used as an objective in work, study, etc., or for practice. For example, the archer aimed at the target. Task, a piece of work to be done. For example, their task is to clean the office. Taste, the sensation that results from eating or drinking something, a flavor. For example, the cake has a rich chocolate taste. Tax, a compulsory contribution to state revenue, levied by government authority on goods, income, property, etc. For example, they pay taxes on their earnings. Tea, an aromatic beverage made from the leaves of the tea plant and usually served hot or cold with sugar and milk. For example, she makes her tea black without sugar. Teach, to impart knowledge to, instruct. For example, he teaches mathematics at the university. Team, a group of persons cooperating or competing together for a common goal. For example, they are part of the same team. Tear, to tear something apart, to cause to split and separate along natural lines such as folds. Also, a drop of liquid that escapes from the eyes in response to pain or emotion. For example, she cried and tears fell down her cheeks. Meaning of a drop of liquid. Meaning of causing something to split. Tell, to say or give information about, relate the story of. For example, she told him the news. Term, a word used in a particular science, trade, profession, etc., having a special meaning not precisely applicable outside that subject. For example, he uses technical terms in his research paper. Terrible, causing or likely to cause intense feelings of dread, frightful. It can also mean extremely bad or unpleasant. For example, she found the experience terrible. Territory, an area over which control or authority is exercised by one person or group. For example, each member has their own territory in the game. Terror, extreme and overwhelming horror, a state of extreme fright or fear. It can also refer to the act of frightening or harming others for political reasons. For example, she felt terror during the storm. Test, an examination designed to measure knowledge, aptitude, or ability. For example, they take a test at the end of each chapter. Then, used to introduce the second element in a comparison, used for forming comparisons by using comparative adjectives and adverbs. For example, she is taller than her sister. Thank, to express gratitude or appreciation. For example, they thank their guests for coming. That, used to introduce a demonstrative adjective such as that, those. For example, she bought the book that was on sale. The theater, a building or space where plays, movies, operas, etc. are performed. For example, they go to the theater for an evening show. There, belonging to them, of or relating to a specified person or group already mentioned or easily identified from context. For example, their house is beautiful. Theirs, the thing or things that belong to them collectively. For example, theirs is the next turn. Them, used as an object pronoun after a preposition or verb, referring to people already mentioned. For example, I gave it to them. Then, at that time, at this time yesterday. It can also mean used to form the past conditional tense. For example, they went there then. Theory, a set of statements or principles devised to explain a group of facts or phenomena. For example, she presents her theory in her research paper. There, at that place, at the specified location, used as an adverb. For example, there is a park nearby. These, belonging to or affecting them. It can also mean referring to things or persons mentioned earlier in the discourse. For example, these are her favorite books. They, used as a plural pronoun for people already mentioned, of them collectively. For example, they went for a walk yesterday. Thick, having considerable bulk or thickness. It can also mean dense or viscous. For example, she wears thick glasses to see clearly. Thin, not thick, slender and not fleshy. It can also mean meagerly supplied with something needed or desired. For example, he is thin for his height. Thing, a person, place, or object regarded as a single entity. For example, she picked up the thing from the floor. Think, to form an idea in the mind, to consider or reflect upon something mentally. For example, he thinks deeply about his future plans. Third, next after the second and just before the fourth in order of counting. It can also mean following two others as a unit of measure or number. For example, she is the third person in line. This, belonging to or affecting one, used for emphasis or contrast with something else mentioned earlier. For example, this is the book I wanted. Those, belonging to or affecting them, referring back to things already mentioned. For example, those are their books. Though, although, even though. For example, she was sick though she went to work. Thought, a mental process in which the mind takes note of something. It can also mean the thing thought about. For example, he had a good thought for his friend's birthday. Threaten, to indicate or warn against some evil, danger, etc. To make someone fear harm or loss. For example, they threaten to leave if conditions do not improve. Through, from one end to the other, all the way through a period of time. It can also mean by means of, with the help of. For example, she went through the book. Throw, to propel something in an arcing motion or with force by a quick movement of the hands or arms, to cast. For example, he threw the ball to his teammate. Thus, in this way, therefore. It can also mean in that manner or form. For example, she did it thus. Tie, a piece of fabric used around the neck for dressiness and often to hold a jacket lapel together. To tie something around someone's neck. For example, he wears a tie with his suit. Tight, having little looseness or play, closely fitting. It can also mean firm in enforcement of discipline or control. For example, she tied the knot tight. Time, a non-spatial framework used to sequence events on a temporal basis and to quantify duration or intervals between events. For example, they will meet at 3 o'clock in time. Tin, metal, especially tin plate, a small container made of metal such as tin. It can also mean an alloy used for making cans. For example, she uses tin to make containers. Tiny, extremely small in size or scope. Minute. For example, he has tiny hands. Tire, a ring of rubber and fabric that covers the wheel of a vehicle, such as an automobile. It can also mean to tire someone by use of exertion. For example, she tires easily after walking long distances. Title, a name used to identify something, a heading or label for something. For example, he wrote his title on the document. 2. Used in giving direction as toward an object or place. For example, go to the store. Today, at present. Now, it can also mean as of today. For example, they are meeting today at noon. Together, in company or conjunction with one another, unitedly. It can also mean all together. For example, they played together for a long time. Tomorrow. On the next day from now. It can also mean to come to a conclusion. For example, they will meet tomorrow at 10 a.m. Tone, a characteristic sound or timbre that is constant within a musical note and distinguishes it from others of the same pitch but different quality. It can also mean manner of speaking, inflection. For example, she spoke with a firm tone. Tongue, the muscular organ in the mouth used for tasting, articulating speech sounds, etc., and for moving food to the rear of the oral cavity. For example, she uses her tongue to taste the dessert. Tonight, in or during this present evening, at night now. For example, they are going out tonight. 2. Also, in addition. It can also mean to the same degree that. As much or many as. For example, she is too tired to go. Tool, a device or implement used in accomplishing a task or function. For example, he uses tools for his work. Tooth, the hard structures in the mouth used for chewing food, a division of a chapter or book. For example, she brushed her teeth before bed. Top, the highest part, the upper side of something. It can also mean the latest thing or trend. For example, he put the cap on top of his head. Total, involving every component included in a whole group. It can also mean all together as a total sum. For example, she paid a total of $10 for her groceries. Touch, to come into contact with something by means of the skin, to feel or handle something. For example, she touched the fabric of the dress. Toward, directed in a certain direction, moving steadily toward a point. It can also mean for the benefit or advantage of someone, used especially after verbs expressing motion. For example, he moved toward her. Town, a relatively large human settlement smaller than a city. An incorporated human settlement larger than a village. For example, they live in a town by the river. Track, a continuous, narrow path or strip along which something can go. A record of events kept as a list, series, or collection of data or information. For example, she recorded her progress on track. Trade, the exchange of goods and services for money. The buying and selling of goods, especially over large areas. It can also mean to deal in, handle, or transfer something. For example, they are engaged in trade with many countries. Tradition, a belief or behavior pattern characteristic of a particular group of people, and accepted as an inherited institution by members of each generation. For example, she follows the family tradition of baking cookies at Christmas. Traffic, the act of moving in large numbers, the movement of many persons or things to and from a place, such as streets, roads, etc. It can also mean the flow of goods. For example, there is heavy traffic during rush hour. Train, a line of rail cars coupled together and usually propelled by an engine. A railway vehicle consisting of a series of connected passenger compartments drawn along rails by a locomotive. It can also mean to teach or instruct someone in something. For example, they are taking the train to work. Transport, the activity or business of transporting goods and passengers. Any means such as a vehicle used for moving people or things from one place to another. For example, they use transport services frequently. Travel, to journey across or through a territory, journey in general. It can also mean the act of traveling to and fro in an area. For example, she enjoys traveling to new places. Treason, the offense of betraying one's country, as by attempting to overthrow its government or giving aid to its enemies. It can also mean behavior showing a lack of loyalty. For example, he was convicted of treason for his actions. Treasure, something of great value, valuable goods kept as hoardings or hidden from view and safekeeping. For example, they found the treasure in the old chest. Treat, to deal with someone kindly, to treat someone fairly and kindly. It can also mean to provide medical attention for a disease or condition. For example, he treats his patients with care. Treaty, a formal agreement between two or more states concerning their relations and behavior, a document containing such an agreement. For example, they signed the treaty at the meeting. Tree, an organized form of government in which power is concentrated in the hands of one person, such as a king or president. It can also mean a plant with a single stem or trunk surmounted by branches. For example, he planted a tree in his garden. Trial, a formal and public examination in court to determine guilt or innocence, an effort as of a substance to separate out valuable material from waste. For example, they are going to trial for their case. Tribe, a social group smaller than and dependent on a nation. It can also mean a division of a larger unit into subordinate units or classes. For example, she belongs to the tribe of her ancestors. Trick, a cunning scheme used especially to cheat, an ingenious though deceitful device. For example, he uses tricks to win at cards. Trip, a short journey or excursion. For example, they take a trip every year. Troop, an army unit, a group of persons who go together in the same direction. For example, he led his troops into battle. Trouble, a state of difficulty or disorder, a cause for concern. It can also mean to harass, worry someone. For example, she is troubled by her health issues. Truck, an automobile designed primarily for the transport of goods and materials, used with singular verb. Any large truck or other vehicle used in transporting freight. It can also mean to move a heavy load, carry. For example, he drives a truck for his job. True, in accordance with fact, accurate or exact. It can also mean real and not counterfeit. For example, she always tells the truth. Trust, confidence reposed in another's integrity, ability, etc., faithfulness to obligations or promises, reliability. For example, he trusts his friends with his secrets. Try, to make an attempt to do something, put forth effort to do something. It can also mean to test the quality of something. For example, she tried a new recipe for dinner. Tube, a cylindrical or tubular structure in a living body, such as an artery or vein. A device consisting of a long, narrow, flexible tube through which fluids can be drawn off or injected into the body. For example, she uses a tube to administer medication. Turn, to move or cause to move around a central point, cause to change position or direction, as in walking, turning one's head. It can also mean an act of changing sides. For example, he turned at the corner. Twice, 2 times, 2 occasions, by twos. For example, she reads the book twice. Tire, another spelling of tire used primarily in British English. Under, below, or on a lower level. In a position that is below something else. For example, the book is under the table. Understand, to comprehend or grasp the meaning, nature, or significance of something. For example, she understands the concept well. Unit, a single thing regarded as an entity complete in itself, but also forming part of a whole. For example, 1 kilogram is a unit of mass. Universe, the totality of all existing things, everything that exists in space and time. For example, scientists study the universe through various means. Unless, a conjunction meaning except on condition that, or if not. For example, she will go to the party unless it rains. Until, up to a particular point in time, before which something happens or is carried out. For example, I will wait until you arrive. Up, in or toward a higher position or level, upward. For example, lift your hand up. Upon, relating to the surface of something on top or close to it, on account of. For example, the book is upon the table. Urge, to strongly recommend or encourage someone to do something, to incite or stimulate someone. For example, he urged her to go for a walk. Us, the people including the speaker and others mentioned, inclusive first-person plural pronoun. For example, let us celebrate together. Use, to employ or put into action for some specific purpose, to take advantage of something useful or convenient. For example, use this tool wisely. Valley, a low area between hills or mountains, typically one in which a river flows. For example, the town is located at the foot of a valley. Value, the importance, worth, or usefulness of something, the price for which something can be bought or sold. For example, the value of education cannot be measured in dollars alone. Vary, to change or cause to change from a previous state or condition, to differ from something else of the same general kind. For example, the temperature varies throughout the day. Vegetable, a plant or part of a plant cultivated for food. Any edible parts of plants other than the fruits, such as roots, stems, leaves, and flowers. For example, tomatoes are often considered vegetables despite being botanically fruits. Vehicle, any means of conveyance that transports people or goods from one place to another. For example, a car is a vehicle used for transportation. Version, a form or instance of something. A particular version of a product, document, etc. For example, there are several versions of the software available. Vary, to a high degree or extent, extremely. For example, she runs very fast. Veto, the right to reject or prevent a proposal or decision by refusing to give consent. For example, the president has the power to veto legislation. Vicious, showing extreme cruelty, brutality, or vindictiveness, harmful in effect. For example, vicious storms can cause widespread damage. Victim, a person who is injured, damaged, or killed as a result of crime, accident, etc. Someone who suffers from a disease, condition, etc. For example, the victim was found unconscious at the scene. Victory, the successful conclusion of a struggle, contest, or battle, triumph over an opponent. For example, they celebrated their victory in the match. View, a way of regarding or interpreting something, an opinion or belief. For example, people have different views on the best way to solve the problem. Violence, the use of physical force so as to injure, destroy, or intimidate. The quality of being forceful and intense. For example, acts of violence often lead to tragedy. Visit, to go to see someone or something for a short time, to make a brief trip to somewhere. For example, they planned a visit to the museum. Voice, the sound made by the human vocal cords as in speaking, singing, etc. The ability to express opinions or ideas, a person's distinctive style of speaking. For example, she has a clear voice that everyone can hear. Volume, the amount of space occupied by something, its three-dimensional extent, the strength of a sound. For example, the volume of water in the container is measured in liters. Vote, to express one's preference or choice, to cast a ballot in an election or referendum. For example, citizens vote for their preferred candidates. Wage, money paid regularly to a person employed. A period of active military or civil conflict. For example, workers earn wages for their labor. Wait, to remain in one place in order to see, meet, or receive someone, to endure while waiting for something. For example, they waited at the bus stop. Walk, to move along with the feet alternately raised and set down, a short journey on foot. For example, they went for a walk in the park. Wall, a structure made of blocks or stones or bricks serving to enclose an area or support a roof or part of a building. A line separating two areas. For example, there is a wall around the garden. Want, to desire, to wish for, to lack and need. For example, she wants a new book. War, a state of open and declared war between countries or groups, active operations in such a conflict. For example, they lived through a time of war. Warm, having a temperature that is higher than cold but not hot, having the quality of providing warmth. For example, wearing warm clothes keeps you cozy on a chilly day. Warn, to give warning to or inform someone about something potentially dangerous or harmful. For example, they warned her about the steep cliff. Wash, to clean with water and detergent, to rinse away by means of water. For example, she washed the dishes after dinner. Waste, useless or harmful expenditure, materials thrown away as no longer useful. For example, not recycling is a waste of resources. Watch, a device worn on the wrist that tells time, to keep an eye on or observe someone or something closely. For example, she watched the children play in the yard. Water, the clear, transparent liquid that falls as rain and forms streams, lakes, and seas. A substance made by combining hydrogen and oxygen in equal parts. For example, plants need water to grow. Wave, a movement or flow resembling that of waves on water. A gesture used to attract attention or express enthusiasm. For example, the flag waved in the breeze. Way, a method, route, or manner of doing something. A means of going from one place to another. For example, there are different ways to get to the city center. We, used as the subject of a verb when referring to oneself and other people including the speaker. Inclusive first-person plural pronoun. For example, we will meet later. Weak, lacking strength or power, not strong. For example, she is feeling weak after her illness. Wealth, an abundance of valuable possessions or resources, great financial success. For example, the country has a wealth of natural resources. Weapon, a tool or instrument used to kill or injure someone or something, a means of achieving an aim. For example, they use weapons for self-defense. Wear, to have on one's body as clothing, to put clothes or equipment on oneself. For example, he wears glasses for better vision. Weather, the general state of the atmosphere with respect to heat, cloudiness, dryness, sunshine, wind, rain, etc. The immediate atmospheric conditions at a given place and time. For example, the weather is unpredictable this time of year. Week, a period of 7 days, a unit for measuring time. For example, there are 5 working days in a week. Weight, the quality of being heavy or ponderous. The amount of matter in something as measured by its gravitation attraction on a scale. For example, she carries a bag with some weight. Welcome, to greet someone with pleasure and friendliness. For example, they were warmly welcomed at the event. Well, in good health, healthy, not ill. For example, she is feeling well after her recovery. West, the region situated to the west of a specified location, the direction toward which the sun sets. For example, the city lies to the west of the mountains. Wet, damp or covered with water. For example, the pavement was wet from the rain. What, a pronoun used to refer to an object or quality not previously identified. a word used to introduce a subordinate clause. For example, what did you do today? Wheat, a cereal grass widely cultivated for its edible grain, which is ground into flour and made into bread, etc. For example, wheat is the main crop in many regions. Wheel, a circular object that rotates on an axle or a pair of axles to facilitate movement, a device used to steer a vehicle. For example, cars have 4 wheels. When, at what time, during which period, at any time that. For example, when will you come? Where, in what place or position, in or into what location? For example, where is the library located? Whether, concerning whether something is so or not, indicating doubt about a fact or point of opinion. For example, I don't know whether it will rain tomorrow. Which, used to refer to one of 2 or more specified things previously mentioned or implied. For example, which book do you prefer? While, during the time that something is happening. For example, while she was walking, a car passed by. White, the color that results from reflection of all visible lights, lacking or deficient in pigment. For example, a white sheet is free of stains. Who, used to refer to persons or things previously mentioned or implied. For example, who called me earlier? Whole, consisting of an undivided unit or entirety, complete as a whole. For example, the whole family came together for dinner. Why, to what cause something is due, on what grounds something can be explained. For example, why did you come late to the meeting? Wide, extending much from side to side. Broad in comparison with its depth or height. For example, a wide road allows easier traffic flow. Wife, the wife of a man, the female partner in a marriage. For example, she is her husband's devoted wife. Wild, growing without cultivation or care, not domesticated, untamed and free living. For example, wildflowers grow naturally in meadows. Will, a document setting out instructions for someone's property after death. Future tense used to indicate a desire or intention that will be carried into effect later, used with shall. For example, she has written her will. Win, to achieve victory by defeating one's opponent, to succeed in a contest. For example, they won the match easily. Wind, air moving rapidly through space with sufficient force to produce audible noise, the direction from which wind is blowing opposite of calm. For example, the wind was strong during the storm. Window, an opening set into an architectural surface and covered by glass for admitting light or air or both. For example, there are 2 windows in the room. Wine, a fermented alcoholic beverage made from grapes or other fruit. Any similar liquor such as sherry, claret, etc. For example, they enjoyed a glass of wine with dinner. Wing, the extended part of an airplane for generating lift and providing directional control. 1/2 of a pair of folded structures used by birds and insects in flight. For example, the bird has 2 wings to fly. Winter, the season during which the temperature is at its lowest, characterized by cold weather with much snow or rain. For example, it gets very cold during winter. Wire, a thin metal object designed for drawing liquid through or conveying electricity, a slender rod or thread of flexible material, such as metal. For example, they use wires to connect electrical devices. Wise, having or showing sound judgment and good sense, possessing knowledge and ability. For example, she is wise in her choices. Wish, to desire that something should happen or be the case, to have a strong hope for the fulfillment of some desire. For example, I wish for peace in the world. With, used before indicating the person or thing with which someone does something. Used before introducing an accompanying item. For example, she read the book with her sister. Withdraw, to remove something from a position or place, to recall or renege on a promise, statement, etc., especially because of changed circumstances. For example, they withdrew their offer due to unforeseen circumstances. Without, not having or lacking something, not with. For example, she went without dinner. Woman, an adult female human. For example, she is a kind-hearted woman. Wonder, to experience a feeling of surprise mixed with admiration, to be impressed by the size or complexity of something. For example, people wonder at the beauty of nature. Wood, a material made up of the stems and branches of trees. A growth or stand of trees. For example, they built a house using wood. Wool, the soft curly fiber that grows in profuse fine layers under the skin of sheep and some other animals forming their fleece. Yarn spun from this. For example, they knitted a sweater with wool. Word, a single distinct element of speech or writing, something expressed by a word or set of words. For example, hello is a short word. Work, activity involving mental or physical effort done to achieve some end, especially for pay. The place where one performs work as an employee. For example, she enjoys her work at the office. World, the whole earth and everything on it as regarded in relation to its people, a part of the world or universe. For example, the world is full of diverse cultures. Worry, to be concerned or troubled by uncertainty, to cause concern or anxiety about something. For example, they worry about their child's safety. Worse, less good or favorable than something else, lower in degree, inferior. For example, her condition has worsened over time. Worth, having a value of a specified amount. For example, the painting is worth a lot of money. Wound, a cut or abrasion on one's skin that penetrates to the dermis and bleeds. Injury caused by cutting, thrusting, or tearing. For example, she received a minor wound during the accident. Wreck, the remains of something that has been completely destroyed or ruined in an accident, such as a ship. For example, they found the wreck of the old ship. Write, to express thoughts and feelings in writing, to set down in words. For example, she wrote her thoughts in a journal. Wrong, not correct or accurate, erroneous. For example, using the wrong tool for the job is inefficient. Yard, a plot of ground adjoining a house, a small walled or enclosed piece of land. For example, they keep their tools in the yard. Year, a period of 365 or 366 days during which the earth completes its revolution around the sun. A complete cycle of seasons, a period used to measure time. For example, she has lived in the city for 5 years. Yellow, having the color between green and orange in the spectrum, having the hue of ripe lemons or buttercups. For example, bananas are yellow when they are ripe. Yes, an affirmative response, an expression used to answer a question with agreement. For example, she replied yes when asked if she wanted to go. Yesterday, the day immediately preceding the present one, a day that has already passed. For example, yesterday it was sunny. Yet, so far, still used in negative sentences or questions. For example, he hasn't arrived yet. You, used as the subject of a verb when referring to oneself and others including the listener. Inclusive second-person plural pronoun. For example, you can join us anytime. Young, not fully grown or developed, immature. For example, young trees are still small.